primary goal, of course, is to make payments for our development purposes, trying to get the money to our destinations. And I hope to tell a little story in a while about an interesting problem we had with a payment there. So again, all of these come through internal messaging and then flow out through our SWIFT network. We're big users of SWIFT, as you would imagine. Although we have the name bank in our title, the World Bank is not really a bank. We're not a deposit-taking institution. We have to work through all of our banks. So on any given day, we may have issues of delayed payments, payments held up for compliance reasons. We may have an inbound swap flow, which we're in a particular currency which we're using to meet debt service needs on the outbound side, and that inbound flow hasn't come in as expected, which gets us very, very excited. So there's some of the issues that we face within our treasury function.
And then very similar story at GE. So as you may hear, like we really operate organically from acquisitions and divestitures. So our company has about 200 ERPs across the company that we use to process either payables or receivables, 200 bank partners, 9,000 bank accounts. And so just the complexity of managing that and then all the supplier relationships is complicated. You know, whether it's the, getting a payment out the door and being able to make sure that the status of that, simple things like the status of that payment, we know where it is versus what it says upstream for the person actually managing that supplier record, to the collection side where we're trying to see the details, the remittance details that come in with those payments that get lost through the financial network. So that's kind of, we're managing that in 180 countries as well. So you have the 60 plus currencies like these gentlemen mentioned. So that's kind of what we do on a daily basis.
Wow. I like in Dr. Bernanke's talk, how he described, I think it was he or Gene Sterling said the current system, the financial system is horse and buggy-ish, despite this very sophisticated, complex stuff you do. And that brings her to the next question, and I like this one, is tell us more about one of the biggest, for lack of a better word, screw-ups you've encountered, like when things go wrong, how bad did it get? I don't know. It sounds like, Paul, you might have one in mind.
We never have those. Never, ever. I'm sure none of you do either. But it's a close-run case, which I thought was the politically correct way of handling this question, actually. So we almost had a little disaster. So again, as I mentioned, the World Bank, different entities within the World Bank are making loans on projects. And these transactions are initiated by development specialists, economists. All of the banking services are aggregated in our treasury. We had a payment that was going in 2015 to Yemen. And this is about a year after the Houthi rebellion had begun and a conflict was breaking out in that area. So all of our correspondent banks, of course, are paying very, very close attention to any funds going into that region. Fragile and conflict-affected countries are always on our payments list. We're actually trying to help in all of these regions. So it's very, very important from our mission purpose. Well, this particular payment had been released. It had gone through to our correspondent bank, and they had blocked it for compliance reasons and come back asking us some questions about exactly what it was. So we, in turn, our staff had reached back to the team that initiated this loan in bank operations, and they came back with additional information, which we were busy cutting and pasting into a SWIFT message to get back to our correspondent bank. But this information indicated that it was money for some agricultural development, honey production, developing livestock. There was a second component that was in relation to infrastructure, and the last remark in this text was, and for building tanks. And we came within a whisker of putting that information cut and paste from one into another before we realized, well, are we certain we want to tell our banks that we're sending this money to Yemen to build tanks? Now, there was certainly insufficient money there to produce an Abrams tank. That was not quite possible, and somebody ought to have been able to figure this out. Nonetheless, these were water tanks, and so we had to go back to the team just to get a much better explanation of what we were doing. But that's the kind of issue we can sometimes face, that if we're not really clear about what our payments are for as they're going into fragile and conflict areas, and that we are licensed through OFAC to deliver these payments on these projects, recognizing the work that we do, we can get those funds blocked and tied up and inhibit our work and inhibit the effect of it. But that was a close run case that we had, sending money for tanks to a war zone.
Can you top that?
I don't know that I can top it. I don't have as fancy of a story that, but I'll tell you one story that we had recently where we were simply trying to make a cross-border payment to a supplier in Australia, and the payment got stuck with one of the correspondent banks, and we kept asking for a status of it, and we could not get a status. We couldn't get anything through bank reporting over SWIFT, and we couldn't get the banks to acknowledge the status, and so we reprocessed the payment, and it got stuck again. And eventually the bank came back and said, okay, here's what you need to do. And you can imagine the hops upstream in a corporate environment where now you have to go and amend the beneficiary information and get approvals and reconcile and all this good stuff. And so, long story short, at the end of the day, we sent it through again, and then it became a duplicate payment because for some reason that payment that didn't go out the first time decided it would magically clear. And then starts the swirl of actually trying to recall one of those two payments. So that's really the day in the life. I mean, it's not an extraordinary circumstance, but you can imagine the magnitude of that in 180 countries and really trying to deal with the different currencies and banks. It becomes very complicated.
And how long did it take you to untangle that from start to finish?
4 weeks, about 4 weeks, yeah. And that's people costs. Like in an environment where, we're trying to be very cost conscious, that's human FTEs, people that are chasing down these transactions. So it's that we're really lacking in, we always compare it to that Amazon model where, I order something online, I know I paid for it, I know it's shipping, they actually deliver it at my front doorstep and tell me it's on my front doorstep even though I'm not home to see it. And so we really like to see payments more behave like that.
How about you, Kabil? You must have some good war stories from Airbnb.
Yeah, lots. I think part of the challenge for us, it's kind of looking back at our host community and really acknowledging what they do and why they do it. It's already hard enough for people to welcome strangers into your own home. One of the things that Airbnb actually does is has the host focused on the money, the experience, and not the money. And one of our promise to our community is that we're going to actually get payments to you within 24 hours after somebody checks in. A key reason we hold those payments back is actually to make sure the place is what it is and people are satisfied with what they've selected. So knowing this context, as you could imagine, not every part of the world operates effectively in how to actually unlock that money for the host, irrespective of when we actually send it. We've had multiple issues like yourself where by building this diverse network of partners to process payments, not knowing where they're actually connected into the local networks and not, we've actually had duplicate payouts. So some hosts have actually seen Christmas multiple times on our platform in a single year. But I'll kind of give you one specific example in Argentina. So we have a network of partners that we actually use to process payments around the world. But what we didn't know is that some of these networks and these partners actually use other networks and partners to get the money to where it needs to. And by the time the coding of the payment that goes from the first partner to the next partner, ultimately to the recipient's banks, the word Airbnb and what it's for has completely disappeared. And so you could send payment through one partner, it looks like one way. You send it through another, it looks completely different. And in Argentina, we had actually one of our network partners change a provider downstream. And what resulted in a pretty big issue was they forgot to tell us, and we weren't prepared for this, but since the recipients banks in Argentina couldn't recognize what the payment was for and didn't actually identify that the deposit tax was paid for, that Argentinian consumers face when they actually do get a deposit in the bank, money just sat in that local recipient's bank with nobody to found. And so if you could imagine when the host started calling us to look for their money, and they started a chain of events of tracking down payments, it took longer to track down that payment than it takes us to deliver a cash payment in a market like Cuba. And that was a pretty eye-raising experience, because these people, they rely on that payment, and these people are not making hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're looking at Airbnb to supplement their income, and delays in payments is almost like missing a rent payment.